Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. And may the peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be upon you. I want you to just imagine for a moment being the leader of a burgeoning civilization.
Right, like the weight of the world on your shoulders.
Exactly. You're constantly under the threat of assassination, you're managing armies, negotiating with hostile empires. Your daily life is just defined by unimaginable external pressure.
Oh, absolutely. The stress levels would be off the charts.
Right. But the most complex, politically sensitive, and frankly emotionally dangerous conspiracy you have to navigate today isn't happening on a battlefield.
No, it's not.
It is happening right inside your own kitchen.
So, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are extracting a highly practical, actionable life guide for Islamic conjugal relations.
And we're doing that by taking a really comprehensive verse-by-verse journey through Surah At-Tahrim, specifically verses 3 through 5.
Yeah, and it is just a truly staggering text to unpack. We are looking at this wild tapestry of linguistics, theology, history, and, really profound human psychology. All of it intersecting in the most intimate setting possible, which is the domestic home.
Right, and we really need to set the stage here because when we look at the prophetic household, the home of Prophet Muhammad, it is so easy for modern readers to just view it as this distant collection of historical biographies.
Oh, for sure. We tend to imagine these figures as, untouched by regular human emotion, just statues living in 7th century Arabia.
Exactly, they didn't have bad days or arguments, but the sources we are using today reframe that entirely. They describe the prophetic household not as a museum, but as a divine crucible.
I love that phrase, divine crucible. Because in Islamic jurisprudence, the domestic disputes of the prophet weren't just private matters that accidentally leaked into the historical record.
Right, they weren't just tabloids.
No, not at all. They were intentionally, purposefully brought into the purview of eternal Quranic revelation.
Which is such a fascinating concept when you stop to think about it. Why broadcast the private arguments of a prophet to the entire world until the end of time?
Well, it's to establish universal principles of human interaction, right? By taking these highly intimate, really heated domestic disputes and elevating them to divine revelation, the text effectively demystifies the prophetic household.
It takes this elite, almost untouchable family and presents it as a highly accessible archetype.
Exactly. Allah uses the friction in this specific household to give all of humanity a masterclass in marital conflict resolution, emotional intelligence, and spiritual accountability.
And specifically today, we're looking at incidents involving his wives, Hafsa bint Umar and Aisha bint Abu Bakr.
Right, two very prominent figures.
So for you, the listener, whether you are commuting to work right now, maybe you're washing dishes, taking a walk, whatever, as we go through this, I want you to actively reflect on your own relationships.
Put a mirror up to the mechanics of your own marriage or your partnerships.
Yeah, ask yourself, how do you handle secrets when you're frustrated? What is your biological default reaction when you feel backed into a corner during an argument?
How exactly do you apologize? Because, what we're extracting today isn't just ancient history.
No, it is a literal step-by-step manual on conjugal ethics.
It absolutely is. But to understand this manual, to accurately derive these life lessons, Orthodox Sunni scholarship mandates that we have to start with a thorough understanding of the Asbab Nuzul.
Right, the historical context of the revelation, basically the whole what actually happened to trigger these verses question.
Exactly. And right out of the gate, we run into something super fascinating. The opening verses of Surah At-Tahrim present one of the most thoroughly documented yet fiercely debated historical contexts in traditional Islamic historiography.
Yeah, the sources basically give us two completely different incidents that might have triggered these verses.
And it highlights this massive methodological gap, a real epistemological friction between the classical Hadith scholars and the exegetes, the Mufassirun, who focus on Quranic interpretation.
Okay, hold on. Let me stop you right there because epistemological friction is a pretty heavy, 400-level university phrase.
Huh? Yeah, fair enough.
Can we translate that for the tired parent listening right now who just wants to know how to stop arguing with their spouse?
Yeah, let's break it down. In plain terms, it just means there's a tug of war over how we verify truth.
Like which methodology wins out?
Right. Do we trust the absolute strictest chain of historical transmission? Like who said what to whom, even if the story itself seems a little mild?
Okay, or?
Or do we look at the immense gravity and severity of the Quranic verses and say, logically, a much bigger, heavier event must have triggered this? That's the friction.
Got it. The historians and the Quranic interpreters are basically looking at two different sets of clues.
Exactly.
So let's lay out the two incidents because they are both intensely human. The first one is known as the honey incident, right? And this one is fiercely defended by the strictest hadith scholars.
Yes, the honey incident is universally championed by the primary hadith compilations, like Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim.
And the actual event is brilliantly simple and honestly very relatable.
It really is. So the Prophet Muhammad had developed this routine of spending extended time at the residence of his wife, Zainab bint Jahsh.
And while he was there, she would serve him this specific honey concoction that he really favored.
Right. And naturally, this sparked some very human jealousy among the other wives.
Completely natural. Like, why is he spending so much extra time over there?
Exactly. So Hafsa and Aisha, driven by this jealousy over the disproportionate time he was spending with Zainab, they conspired to curtail the habit.
They came up with a whole coordinated plan.
They did. They decided that regardless of whose quarters the Prophet visited next, they would feign physical distaste and claim that his breath carried the unpleasant, lingering odor of magafir.
Which is, for context, a foul-smelling kind of resinous gum from a specific desert tree.
Right, doesn't smell good.
Which honestly is brilliant in a very domestic, strategic way. It's like telling your spouse they have intense garlic breath every time they come back from playing golf, just to subconsciously discourage them from going.
That is the perfect analogy. And they knew his personality, right? The Prophet was known for being intensely sensitive to the feelings of others.
Yeah, he had a deep, well-documented aversion to being the source of any discomfort or offensive odor.
Precisely. They exploited a known character trait, and it worked instantly.
He didn't want to offend them, so he took a solemn oath.
Right, he took an oath to completely prohibit the consumption of this honey for himself forever.
And according to this narrative, he confided this oath to Hafsa, making it a secret and asking her not to tell anyone.
Yes, and scholars like Hafiz ibn Kathir al-Nawawi al-Dahabi, they all strictly back this incident.
Because of the chain of transmission, right?
Exactly. The isnad found in Bukhari is unassailable. For them, that stringent methodology of relying on verified historical chains takes absolute precedence over anything else.
But then we have the second story, the Mariah the Copt incident. And this is where that friction you mentioned earlier really flares up.
It really does.
Because while this second story might not have the impenetrable gold standard chain of transmission that the honey story has, logically, it feels very different.
Right. So this alternative narrative is recorded by scholars like al-Daraqutni and al-Hakim, and heavily discussed by early exegetes like al-Tabari.
Okay, so what happens in this one?
In this account, the Prophet engaged in intimate relations with his concubine, or wife, according to some classifications, Maria. And this happened in the personal quarters of Hafsa on a day structurally assigned to Hafsa while she was temporarily absent.
Ah, okay. So when Hafsa unexpectedly returned.
She was deeply distressed. She confronted him about the perceived disrespect of using her quarters and her specific time.
Which is a huge deal. And to assuage her intense grief, because again, he was incredibly sensitive to the emotional pain of his household, he swears a binding oath forbidding Maria to himself moving forward.
Right. And just like in the other story, he confides this monumental decision to Hafsa as a strict secret.
Urging her not to disclose it to the other wives.
But Hafsa, unable to hold it in, divulges it to Aisha.
And here's where modern scholars, like Abu Ammar Yasir Qadi, point out a powerful logical tension.
Because the domestic dispute over a honey beverage, no matter how much jealousy and plotting was involved, it just seems disproportionately mild.
Right, especially when you juxtapose it with the absolute gravity and severity of the Quranic reprimand that follows in these verses.
Exactly. It's like bringing a Supreme Court ruling down to settle a dispute over who left the milk out on the counter.
Yes, that mismatch in intensity is glaring. Qadi notes that an oath to permanently sever and alter the status of a lawful, intimate relationship carries substantially heavier legal and emotional weight than just giving up a sweet drink.
It creates a real chronological and contextual friction that classical scholars continuously struggle to integrate.
Because the Quranic text demands a severe historical context, but the strictly verified history provides a relatively mild one.
Right, so scholars have to either stretch the severity of the mild event, saying, well, the deception about the honey was actually a massive deal.
Or they have to accept a weaker historical chain that logically fits the gravity of the verses better.
Exactly.
But isn't this exactly why scholars like Syed Abdullah Manudi and Sayyid Qutb argue that getting stuck in the weeds of which incident it was is basically missing the forest for the trees?
That is the ultimate brilliant synthesis here. Maududi emphasizes that the precise nature of the secret is deliberately left vague in the Quran itself.
The text doesn't mention honey, and it doesn't mention Maria.
No, it merely calls the secret a hadithan, a statement, or a matter. The true transgression, the core ethical issue that the Quran is targeting, was identical in both scenarios.
Which was the breach of spousal confidentiality.
Yes, and a coordinated manipulation of the Prophet's emotional disposition by his most trusted confidants.
So let's pivot to what this actually means for the listener, because we move to verse 66.3 and we look at the anatomy of the secret itself.
The verse begins with the Arabic phrase, Wa'id asara al-Nabiyu, and when the Prophet confided.
That root word, asara, is absolutely critical to understand, right?
It really is. It denotes a deliberate, conscious act of hiding, concealing, or entrusting a private matter to someone with the explicit, understood expectation of discretion.
No, it wasn't just passing gossip while doing the dishes.
No, it was an entrusted reality. He entrusted this to Hafsa, but unable to contain the heavy burden of that confidence. Maybe she wanted to share the victory of the honey boycott, or maybe the emotional weight of the Mariah oath was just too much. She divulged the information to her closest peer, Aisha.
And we have to view this through the lens of Quranic marital philosophy. In Islamic ethics, spouses are described as a garment for one another. You see this explicitly in Surah Al-Baqarah.
Beautiful imagery.
Yeah, and what does a garment do? It protects you from the elements, it beautifies you, and most importantly, it conceals your flaws, your nakedness, and your vulnerabilities from the outside world.
By leaking this secret, Hafsa breached that garment. She tore the fabric.
It is a fundamental breakdown of marital confidentiality. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the daily life application for you, the listener, is stark.
It really is. The absolute sanctity of marital discretion is a timeless blueprint.
And the modern, highly prevalent tendency to just broadcast marital grievances stands in direct, aggressive contradiction to this Quranic standard.
Oh, this is so relevant today.
Yeah.
Think about how we handle conflict now. We vent to external parties all the time.
We call our parents to complain about our spouses.
We drop cryptic complaints into social media peer groups.
We post passive-aggressive TikToks. Or we take screenshots of private text arguments and send them to the group chat for validation.
We all do it, or at least feel the urge to. And the Quran treats this modern impulse as spiritually devastating.
Because the home is supposed to be an impenetrable fortress of trust.
Exactly. When you leak the inner workings of your marriage to an external party, even a trusted friend or a sibling, you are actively dismantling the security of that fortress.
You, the listener, you have to be a secure vault for your partner's vulnerabilities. The text treats this leak not as a minor faux pas, not as a little slip of the tongue, but as a severe moral transgression.
Which leads us directly to the second part of verse 66.3.
The leak happens.
Right, Hafsa tells Aisha. And then Allah, via direct divine revelation, approuses the Prophet of this domestic leak. The Quran says Allah made it apparent to him.
And here's where we get to what I honestly believe is one of the most phenomenal masterclasses in emotional intelligence I have ever read in my life.
It's incredible.
The Prophet is armed with absolute, undeniable divine knowledge of his wife's betrayal of confidence. He has her dead to rights. But his reaction is astonishing.
The Quran says he made known part of it and ignored a part. This specific phrase acts as the ultimate cornerstone of Islamic marital psychology. It introduces the profound, transformative concept of taghaful.
Taghaful, the graceful, intentional overlooking of faults. I absolutely love this concept.
It is deeply beautiful. Classical commentators meticulously unpack this highly restrained behavior. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, utilizing his rigorous rationalist analysis, and al-Jalalain, they emphasize that the Prophet deliberately chose not to expose the full, exhaustive extent of the breach to Hafsa.
Even though he knew every single word she said.
He knew everything. But out of immense gentleness and a profound desire to spare her from overwhelming, crushing embarrassment, he only mentioned a fraction of what she had disclosed to Aisha.
Imagine if he had detailed every single aspect of the leaked conversation.
You said this, and then you laughed at this, and then Aisha said this.
And then you replied with this. Recounting every single word she spoke behind his back, the sheer weight of that confrontation would have completely devastated her dignity.
It would have left her with nowhere to hide.
It's the exact opposite of what we tend to do today. Think about modern argument culture.
That was brutal.
When we get into an argument with our spouse, We turn into ruthless lawyers depositing evidence in a courtroom. We don't just address the issue at hand, we bring up the receipt from last week.
We pull up the text message from 3 years ago?
We remind them of that slightly rude thing they said to our mother in 2018. We weaponize a spouse's entire history of mistakes to win the immediate argument. We want to overwhelm them with their own flaws so they have to surrender.
That is such a vivid and accurate analogy. And contemporary scholars like Nouman Ali Khan extrapolate heavily from this exact verse to combat that. Ghafla is genuine ignorance, stupidity, or heedlessness. If you simply don't notice that your spouse is hurting you, that is ghafla. Taghaful, on the other hand, is a highly conscious, active, and intelligent choice to protect the honor of another individual. You signal, I know what happened, but you refuse to rub their face in the totality of their error. You assert boundaries without exacting maximum vengeance.
It's holding back enough to establish accountability without deploying emotional annihilation. You let them know the vault was breached, but you don't burn the house down to prove the point.
Exactly.
And the sources mention prominent Sunni scholars who elevate this trait to the absolute pinnacle of human character. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal famously asserted, 9/10 of good character is taghaful.
Let that sink in. 9/10.
And the early ascetic Al-Hasan al-Basri observed, an honorable person never tries to claim every single one of his rights.
By not extracting every ounce of his right to a full apology, by not demanding total vindication, the Prophet modeled how a spouse must act as an emotional sanctuary, even in the very moments they're dealing with betrayal.
The psychological resilience that takes is incredible. When you are hurt, your ego just screams for vindication.
It does. And Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah intricately links this restrained behavior to spiritual purity. He notes that insisting on total perfection in others, demanding absolute restitution for every slight, it creates unnecessary friction that ultimately deprives the soul of inner peace.
So a heart incapable of taghaful is a heart plagued by rigidity, entitlement, and arrogance.
That's it, exactly. And Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali echoes this sentiment profoundly in his treatise, The Journey to Allah.
What does he say?
This is perhaps the most sobering application for the listener today, and it connects the domestic space directly to the cosmic. Ibn Rajab notes that an individual cannot possibly succeed on the Day of Judgment unless Allah enacts taghaful over their countless sins.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That is heavy.
Think about it. If Allah were to extract absolute justice for every misdeed, every fleeting bad thought, every minor slip of the tongue,
If Allah were a lawyer depositing evidence against you,
humanity would be utterly destroyed. Therefore, the theological rule is established. If you want to be a recipient of divine taghaful on that terrifying day, you must extend interpersonal marital taghaful to your spouse today.
you must forgive as you hope to be forgiven.
Exactly.
For everyone listening, think about that for a second. Apply that to your kitchen right now. How would your marriage change today if you consciously chose not to win every argument?
If you recognize that successful marriages require a high, sustained tolerance for imperfection,
And that your ego-driven desire for absolute vindication must be subordinated to the health of the union. It's completely paradigm shifting.
it radically shifts the paradigm of conflict from me versus you to us versus the problem.
Which brings us right into the third part of verse 66.3 and a fascinating exploration into the psychology of defensiveness.
Because even with the Prophet utilizing taghaful, confronting Hafsa gently with only partial knowledge of her breach, her immediate reaction is so fundamentally human.
She doesn't break down and apologize. She doesn't offer an outpouring of remorse.
She deflects. She asks, "Who told you this?"
Nouman Ali Khan provides a brilliant psychological reading of this highly relatable moment, doesn't he?
He does. He points out that instead of accepting responsibility, the default human biological instinct when caught in a transgression is to pivot immediately to the defensive.
It's the fight-or-flight response manifesting in dialogue.
She shifts the focus entirely away from her own guilt and onto the mechanics of how she was caught. She assumes Aisha betrayed her confidence and ratted her out.
Right. It's the classic political pivot. I'm not going to answer the allegations against me. Instead, I'm launching a full investigation into the leaks.
Yes. By asking, "Who told you this?" she's attempting to change the subject. The underlying sentiment is anger at the secondary party.
She's trying to shift the drama from her betrayal of the Prophet to Aisha's perceived betrayal of her. And as a spouse, when your partner deflects like that, it is so incredibly tempting to take the bait.
It is the ultimate trap in marital arguments.
You want to start arguing about the details. You start defending the source.
Well, your sister told me.
Why were you talking to my sister?
And suddenly you are in the weeds of the he said, she said, and you've completely lost the original plot. So how did the prophet bypass this trap? Because the restraint here is superhuman.
His response is a masterclass in de-escalation. He completely bypasses the interpersonal drama and refuses the bait. He doesn't say, well, I overheard, or Aisha slipped up.
What does he say?
He says, I was informed by the knowing, the acquainted.
Na bananya al-elimu al-kabir.
Instantly removing human informants from the equation entirely.
Wow. He reorients the domestic squabble into a stark theological reality.
Because the prophet refused to play the he said, she said game, the conflict suddenly couldn't be resolved or argued on a human horizontal level. He elevates the conflict from a horizontal power struggle between spouses to a vertical reality. Allah is watching.
Yes.
For you, the listener, navigating a tense argument, this teaches the vital importance of not getting derailed by secondary defensive arguments. Don't investigate the mechanics of the conflict.
Spouses must realize that marital conduct behind closed doors isn't actually hidden. It is continuously observed, recorded, and judged by the divine.
Shifting the accountability to the vertical axis between the individual and Allah diffuses the petty horizontal tension. You aren't arguing with me, you are answering to the principles set by God.
And this transition from the private domestic space to the cosmic divine reality is what triggers the massive escalation we see in the very next verse.
Because the conflict has been elevated to the heavens respond.
Exactly. We move into verse 66.4, and the tone of the revelation shifts sharply. The Quran issues a profound public divine reprimand directed explicitly at Hafsa and Aisha.
Let me read the verse. If you two repent to Allah, it is best, for your hearts have deviated. But if you cooperate against him, then indeed Allah is his protector, and Gabriel and the righteous of the believers and the angels, moreover, are his assistants.
It's intense.
Okay, we really need to pause and dissect this. Let's look at that phrase, your hearts have deviated. Sahat kulubukuma.
A deep linguistic analysis of the etymology is crucial here, because translation often loses the nuance. Sakat originates from the root bagi, which denotes a swerving, a leaning, or a crookedness.
Like a ship veering off course.
Yes, imagine a ship veering off its plotted course. Classical exegetes, including prominent Sahaba like Abdullah bin Masud, interpret this to mean that the hearts of the two wives swerved from the absolute right path.
And Fakhr al-Din al-Razi provides a sharper diagnostic for this, doesn't he?
He says their hearts deviated from what is right, and in this highly specific marital context, the right implies the explicit right of the prophet to peace, obedience, loyalty, and tranquility in his own home.
But we have to be very careful here to maintain the proper theological boundaries, because critics could easily take this too far.
Absolutely. Sayyid Abul al-Madudi clarifies that this deviation was not an act of apostasy, disbelief, or absolute spiritual ruin. It wasn't a rejection of Islam.
So what was it?
It was a momentary but severe lapse in the heightened, stringent standard expected of the mothers of the believers. It was a misalignment of spiritual priorities, where the natural, biological instinct of jealousy momentarily eclipsed their sacred duty to protect the prophet's peace.
Okay, that makes sense. And the verse continues with a stern hypothetical condition about their alliance. But if you cooperate against him, the Arabic term here is tazahara,
which implies mutual support, backing one another up, forming a bloc, or colluding in opposition to a single target.
Sayyid Qutb, in his exegesis, unhesitatingly utilizes the terms co-conspirator and conspiracy to describe their alignment.
While classical scholars often soften their language out of deep reverence for the wives of the prophet, Qutb notes the immense gravity of conspiring against the prophet's decisions, even in domestic matters.
But I have to push back here, or at least ask the question that naturally arises in the mind of any modern reader. Let's look at the response. To deploy Allah, the archangel Jibril, all the angels, and all the righteous believers on earth against two women in a domestic dispute. Isn't that a wildly disproportionate response?
It does seem that way at first glance.
If it was about honey, or even the Mariah incident, mobilizing the entire celestial and terrestrial realm seems like bringing a nuclear bomb to a knife fight.
It is an inherent paradox that exegetes deeply explore. Why this cosmic mobilization over a kitchen conspiracy? Scholars like Sayyid Qutb Maududi and contemporary thinkers like Omar Suleiman analyze this as a theological mechanism to establish the absolute invulnerability of the prophetic mission.
Okay, break that down.
We have to look at the broader geopolitical and psychological context. The prophet was engaged in a relentless, exhausting battle against polytheists who wanted to eradicate his community, hypocrites who were trying to subvert him from within, and hostile empires mobilizing on his borders.
The psychological sanctuary of his home was his primary and often his only refuge.
Right. When the whole world is at war with you, your living room has to be safe.
Exactly.
If his internal sanctuary was compromised by internal politics, if his wives were forming blocs against him, conspiring to manipulate his habits or his relationships, it threatened his emotional fortitude and, by extension, the entire Islamic mission.
Ah, I see. A leader cannot function if he is fighting battles on the front lines and then fighting covert wars in his bedroom.
While minor domestic plots might be common and somewhat harmless in average households, they were fundamentally intolerable and structurally dangerous when the husband was the recipient of divine revelation and the leader of a besieged state.
So Allah is revealing, publicly, that the prophet is never vulnerable, never isolated, and never to be outmaneuvered by domestic factions.
Any attempt to emotionally corner him will be met with the full, unmitigated force of divine sovereignty.
Which gives us our next highly actionable insight from marital jurisprudence. For you, the listener today, this is a vital, essential lesson in boundary setting.
It is. While spouses are partners, emotional manipulation, coercion, or ganging up on a partner is severely condemned in Islamic ethics.
It actively discourages forming toxic domestic factions. You cannot bring in your mother, your sister, and your best friend to form a bloc to emotionally leverage your spouse into doing what you want.
A home cannot function when internal factions are formed. It creates a Cold War dynamic in the kitchen.
True partnership demands direct, honest, vulnerable communication, not collective bargaining against your partner.
That is beautifully stated. And before we move to the final verse, it's really crucial to note how standard Sunni orthodoxy protects the honor of Aisha and Hafsa despite this incredibly severe Quranic reprimand.
Right, because sectarian polemics have historically used verse 66.4 to attack their integrity, pointing to the deviation of their hearts. But Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah vigorously defends them against these claims.
Yes, he does.
How does he frame that defense? Because the verses are undeniably harsh.
He argues that the very command to repent, the invitation to tawbah embedded right at the beginning of the verse, if you too repent to Allah, is actually proof of their high status and ultimate salvation.
The warning was a corrective measure for a momentary lapse, not a permanent spiritual diagnosis.
Exactly. It is a matter of absolute consensus that they sincerely repented, lived lives of immense piety, and died as beloved wives of the Prophet. Their ability to accept this blistering public critique, internalize it without ego, and elevate their character is their ultimate legacy.
They turned their lowest moment into a catalyst for eternal grace.
It proves that you can recover from severe marital mistakes if there is sincere repentance. You are not defined by the worst argument you ever had.
Which transitions us perfectly into verse 66.5, because this verse establishes exactly what true character looks like. We hit the divine ultimatum.
This is a big one.
The verse says, "Perhaps his Lord, if he divorced you all, would substitute for him wives better than you, submitting, believing, devoutly obedient, repentant, worshiping, and fasting, traveling, previously married, and virgins."
This is a definitive, staggering ultimatum. It completely strips away any sense of entitlement or indispensability the wives might have harbored due to their elite aristocratic status.
Remember who we are talking about. Aisha and Hafsa were the daughters of Abu Bakr and Umar, the two most powerful, influential men in the Ummah.
They were the aristocracy of early Islam. But the Quran reiterates that proximity to the Prophet is utterly contingent upon character, piety, and behavior, not mere marital contract or tribal lineage.
Allah is essentially saying, do not think you are irreplaceable because of who your fathers are. The verse then catalogs 6 distinct spiritual attributes that define the ideal marital partner in the sight of Allah.
And we really want to walk through this sequence of excellence because it's not just a random list of good adjectives.
Right. It moves logically from outward submission to profound internalized spiritual states. It's an evolutionary journey of the soul.
The sequence is truly beautiful. It provides a roadmap for personal development within a marriage. It begins with Muslimat, submitting.
This is outward adherence to the laws of Islam. A spouse must first and foremost surrender to the divine will, establishing a baseline of religious practice in the home.
It is the foundation. Praying, giving charity, recognizing the rules of the house.
But outward action isn't enough, which is why the very next trait is mu'minat, believing. This moves from the limbs to the heart. It is inner conviction.
The heart aligns perfectly with the outward actions. It ensures the spouse isn't just acting out of mere cultural conformity or habit, but out of true, deep faith. You don't just pray because it's time to pray, you pray because you believe.
Exactly. And once that internal belief is solidified, it manifests as the third trait, quanitat, devoutly obedient.
This implies a tranquil, sustained compliance to Allah. And within the marital hierarchy, a deep respect for the rightful expectations of a husband, without arrogance or resistance. It's a state of peaceful devotion, not grudging compliance.
Followed by the fourth trait, taibat, repentant, which is highly, highly relevant given the immediate context of verse 4.
You can be submitting, believing, and devout, but you are still human. You will still make mistakes.
So taibat is the capacity to recognize one's flaws and actively turn back to Allah. Within a marriage, it requires a spouse to lack ego. You have to possess the humility to say, I was wrong, I am sorry, let's fix this.
Which is the glue of any long-term relationship. Fifth is abidat, worshiping. This is dedication to servitude, a life anchored in the continuous remembrance of the divine rather than being consumed by worldly frivolities, materialism, or, as we saw in the historical context, petty jealousy.
And then we hit the sixth attribute, and I have to say, this is the most fascinating part of this entire study for me. The word is sihat.
Ah, yes, the etymological deep dive. This single word has generated a massive linguistic and theological discussion among classical commentators.
Lexically, the root saha from siaha implies traveling, wandering, or flowing, like water flows across the earth.
Right, and early scholars documented intense disputes over its exact meaning here. Linguists note the literal meaning is one who travels the land, which is traditionally associated with ascetic monks who abandon worldly comforts to wander the desert and seek spiritual truths.
So how did a word that literally means wandering traveler come to mean fasting in almost all modern Quranic translations?
This is where Hafiz ibn Kathir provides a brilliant metaphorical transition that bridges the linguistic gap. He explains the psychology of the ascetic traveler.
Okay, so a traveler leaves behind a soft bed, abundant food, and the comfort of their home. They embrace hardship for a spiritual goal.
Exactly. Ibn Kathir notes that the individual who fasts strictly abstains from basic desires, food, drink, intimacy, in the exact same way. Thus, the fasting person is undertaking an internal spiritual migration without ever leaving their home.
And we have to consider the socio-cultural reality of the time. For women in 7th century Arabia, literal ascetic wandering in the desert was highly unconventional, impractical, and incredibly dangerous.
So the metaphor of fasting serves as their monasticism or spiritual migration. A spouse who is sayhat is one who has mastered their internal biological impulses.
They can control their hunger, which means they can control their anger, and they can control their tongue.
That is the exact psychological link.
Oh.
A robust consensus, supported by interpretations from eminent Sahaba like Ibn Abbas, Aisha herself, and Abu Huraira, translates sayhat metaphorically as fasting.
But here is where we get the ultimate plot twist of this entire narrative. And if you are listening to this, pay close attention to this payoff. The inclusion of this specific attribute fasting carries a profound historical irony.
Because modern scholars like Omar Suleiman highlight that during the intense emotional fallout of this entire incident, the Prophet actually did temporarily divorce Hafsa.
He did. The breach of trust was so severe that he issued a revocable divorce. However, this divorce was incredibly brief.
The Prophet was commanded directly by the Archangel Jibril to revoke the divorce and take Hafsa back.
And what was Jibril's justification? Because he didn't just say, take her back. He gave a specific reason.
Jibril came to the Prophet and said, "Take Hafsa back, for she is one who fasts much and prays much at night, and she is your wife in paradise."
I mean, that just gives me chills. Hafsa was the very embodiment of the traits listed in the ultimatum.
It's amazing.
The Quran issues this blistering public critique, exposes the conspiracy, and threatens the wives with replacement by women who fast and pray. But Hafsa herself was the ultimate faster and prayer.
It is a breathtaking resolution. This revelation is critical for understanding the holistic, merciful nature of the marital paradigm being taught in Islam.
Her momentary lapse in discretion, the leaking of the secret, the jealousy, the plotting, did not permanently erase her lifelong, grueling devotion to Allah.
This is the ultimate lesson in marital justice for the listener. Think about your own spouse. Spouses will inevitably make errors.
Sometimes grievous, painful errors driven by insecurity, jealousy, or incredibly poor judgment. But Jibril teaches us to weigh the comprehensive character of a spouse.
You cannot define your partner purely by their worst mistake. You cannot look at the one time they broke your trust and erase a decade of loyalty and love.
You must remember their overarching foundational virtues. Just as Jibril reminded the Prophet of Hafsa's fasting and night prayers to secure the restoration of her marriage, modern spouses are deeply encouraged to remember the broader goodness of their partners.
It is a divine demand for a holistic assessment rather than punishing a partner relentlessly for singular lapses.
So let's pull all of this together and synthesize this incredible journey through Surah At-Tahrim. We started by looking at the absolute sanctity of guarding marital secrets, the command to be an impenetrable vault for your partner's vulnerabilities, like a garment that conceals.
We move to institutionalizing the grace of Taghaful, consciously and intelligently overlooking faults rather than weaponizing history like a courtroom lawyer.
We learned how to diffuse biological defensiveness by bypassing the horizontal he said, she said drama and elevating the conflict to the vertical reality, remembering that Allah is always watching.
We saw the severe cosmic warning against forming toxic alliances or ganging up on a spouse to manipulate them.
And finally, we ended on the necessity of assessing your spouse holistically, measuring their totality against their momentary lapses, just as Jibril did with Hafsa.
It is a robust, realistic, and deeply spiritual framework for an eternal marriage. It doesn't pretend marriages are perfect. Instead, it navigates that intense, painful tension between severe divine reprimand and boundless prophetic grace.
It shows us how to be human and how to forgive humans. It really is a masterpiece of emotional intelligence. So, as you go about the rest of your day, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to ponder on your own. We spend so much time searching for spiritual validation in the serene, quiet moments of life. But what if the ultimate, most rigorous test of your faith isn't found in the peaceful solitude of the mosque? What if the true test of your spiritual maturity is found in the chaotic, emotional heat of a kitchen argument? What if your marriage, with all its friction, compromise, and required grace, is actually the truest mirror of your relationship with the divine? Jazakat Hakar, may Allah reward you with goodness for spending your valuable time listening to us.